Hey, Gr8, welcome to your first theory lesson with me. Um, I had other intentions for how this was going to go, but obviously we do the best with what we have. Please excuse the fact that I don't have my face cam on. I have procrastinated a little bit and left this a bit too late, so it's a bit too dark to actually see my face. But I hope that you enjoy the presentation nonetheless. So, what we are going to be looking at today is one of my favorite art history movements. It is called Abstract Expressionism, and it relates directly to what you guys are currently learning at the moment in art with color. So, let's get started. This is how I like to structure the intros to the art history movements: who, where, what, when, why, that sort of stuff. So, Abstract Expressionism, this little squiggle here means circa, and the word circa in relation to dates means around the time of. So abstract expressionism is around the time of 1946 to 1965, but those dates can fluctuate a little bit depending on the artist. Abstract expressionism, the art history movement, mostly took place in America, specifically New York. And the subjects, how we can identify abstract expressionist paintings compared to other paintings, is that they are all color field paintings. And I'll explain what this means in a little bit. And the subjects are abstract ideas. So you're not going to see anything that you can immediately identify, such as a person or an animal or a still life. Our artists, if you see these names, it's safe to assume that's an abstract expressionist painting. We've got Pollock, Rothko, Newman, Still, de Kooning, and Klein. We'll be looking at five. You can Google Klein. The work is very, very interesting. And the abstract expressionists are also known as the New York School because all of these artists were working pretty closely together in the same sort of area of New York. And if you talk about abstract expressionism and the New York School, they are interchangeable. Why do we care? Why are we studying this? Why do we need to know this? And the reason that you guys are specifically studying abstract expressionism is to show you that not all art needs to be realistic or pretty to be valid as art, or to talk about something that is important or deep. So as I go into it a little bit more, you'll learn to understand that the ideas that the abstract expressionists were dealing with are too big and too powerful to display in a realistic way. So, what I mean by that is that we all know that World War II ended in 1945. And as a lot of American soldiers were traveling back to America, they were carrying these very heavy emotional, mental, and physical burdens of what happened during the war. And it wasn't just the soldiers that had to deal with this, it was the people who were at home and learning about what was happening in the war through the news and the newspapers and that sort of stuff. So, what happened after the war was that everybody was sort of trying to process the years and years of trauma that they'd been experiencing, either by losing someone or the way that women had to adjust to working while the men were fighting. It's a long thing. Please feel free to Google how much the world changed during World War II, if that'll make it a little bit easier. But the whole of humanity were trying to process this very hectic thing that had just happened and that had been happening for many, many years. So when the war ended, a lot of people had to adjust to their new normal. And I know that a lot of us are feeling like that right now with what's happening with the pandemic and having to adjust to our new normal very, very quickly. So you can imagine that these abstract expressionists were feeling a lot like you are, where there's this really big worldwide thing happening, but you are just one human being and you are dealing with your stuff and your feelings and all of that other stuff. So, yeah, abstract expressionism happened as a direct result of the war. And because of these very heavy emotional things, they needed to find other ways to process. And one of these methods was art. And because of the nature of how heavy these things were, like war and pain and death and all of these really hectic, heavy things, it's not something you can represent literally, because when you're already feeling traumatized, nobody wants to be reminded of the horrible thing, but you need to talk about it to be able to process it. So the way that the abstract expressionists dealt with this is using the body and gesture. So this thing about gesture becomes very, very important for the abstract expressionists, because they completely shifted the way that they paint in order to make the kinds of paintings that we'll look at now. So the way that they processed these feelings, these heavy things, is through their bodies, and also using non-representational, non-literal things. And I'll show you what I mean in a second. So what is abstract? I'm using this word a lot, but what does it mean? So in relation to art, a work is abstract if you can't literally identify the subject matter. So it's not a human, an animal, or a still life. If it is not any of those three things, it is an abstract work. And what that means is that it could be a bunch of red paint on a canvas. That is abstract because there's not an apple, there's not anything there that you can identify as a thing. And what it also means, the word abstract means we talk about things that are non-literal, but that still exist. So you can feel love, you know that it exists, but you can't physically touch it. You can't put love in a gift box and give it to someone, but we know that it exists and we can feel it. So that is what the abstract expressionists were dealing with, is they were dealing with these abstract things like war and all of the emotions that they were carrying. So the abstract as an artwork and the abstract things that they were dealing with link in really, really nicely. But if my definitions don't make sense, please feel free to Google this. Okay, so how the works were made. I've spoken about gesture and the human body. So before this point in time, how artists would paint is they would put their paintings on an easel, which is like a wooden thing that they is used to stand the work upright, and they would either sit or stand and paint like that. But what the abstract expressionists did is they put the canvas on the floor. So you can see here, this is Mr. Jackson Pollock. He's one of my favorite painters in the whole world. And he has a giant roll of paper and he is painting on the floor, and it allows him to move in a dynamic and bodily way. And Jackson Pollock painted with his whole body. And as we look at the artworks, you might be looking at this and saying, yes, but I could have made that. But the answer is you could have, but not really, because no one else in the world has ever had the life experience that Jackson Pollock has had. No one else has ever thought like him, felt like him, and had the relationships that he had. So the way that he painted was very, very unique and very different compared to some of the other people. And that is what makes him so revolutionary to this point in art history, because he was like, nah, stuff it. This working upright thing doesn't work for me. I'm going to work on the floor. And you can see here, he's got a tin of paint and a big brush. And he used to use all sorts of weird and wacky and wonderful things to get his paint onto the canvas. And it looks like he's doing it really, really randomly, but he is thinking very carefully about layering and this beautiful black splodge here, what's it going to look like with other splodges on top of it? So it looks very random, but he's actually very calculated. And one of the things I admire the most about him is that he is able to see the big picture in these enormous artworks. I mean, some of them are 2, 3, 4 meters long, which is huge. So yeah, so the abstract expressionists, not all of them, but most of them chose this different way of working, which also allowed them to make works that were a lot bigger, because they didn't have to like climb up a ladder to get to the top of the artwork. They could just move it around. So yeah, comes back to the body gesture, awesome way that these works were made, and I hope that it helps you to understand them a little bit more. So I'm going to move that over there. So this is Full Fathom 5 by Jackson Pollock. So you can see down here, this is what we call the empirical data. This is what helps us to identify an artwork. So when you get to grade 9, you'll look at a visual, you'll start learning how to do a visual analysis. And there are two ways that you can do that. You can either read all of this stuff first, or you can look at the artwork first. So I'm just drawing your attention to this just quickly. So the title of the artwork is here. Excuse me, Jackson Pollock is the artist. It was made in 1947, falls into our dates. It's oil on canvas, and it is 129 centimeters by 76 centimeters. So it's just longer than a meter widthways and just short of a meter lengthways. So it's big. I mean, if you hold your arms out, that's a meter. It's quite big. And then MoMA, Museum of Modern Art in New York. If you ever get the chance to go, please go. It's really, really wonderful. So we looked at in the last slide a photo of Jackson Pollock actually doing his paintings, and it now makes a lot more sense how he was able to make things like this. And this is an abstract work because you can't tell me exactly what this is. It's just color. It is a field, like a sports field of color. And you can see the way that Jackson Pollock's body has moved while he's made these artworks. And one of the significant things about the color field paintings was their size. So if you can imagine a meter out in front of you and imagine it just above eye level, and imagine gazing into this really rich, detailed painting, and try and imagine how you would feel. Some of you would feel a bit bored. Some of you would feel very overwhelmed by everything that's going on here. And it is a characteristic of the abstract expressionists that a lot of people, normal, everyday people, would go in front of these artworks and they would burst into tears because of the overwhelming feeling that they got from those artworks. And that is what allowed the artists to so successfully process the feelings and the stuff that they were dealing with from the war without having to literally actually represent a war. And to me, this looks like a battlefield. It's completely chaotic. You have no idea what's going on. There's bits and pieces. You think you've got a plan, like the circle looks like a plan, but nope, that might not be the thing. And because of the sensory stimulation that these works give us, it's what makes them so awesome. Also, how Jackson Pollock pays attention to color. He's a big fan of black and white, as you can see, but also this lovely lavender color, which is very soft in comparison to the rest of these very intense colors. And then we've got these little moments of orange, little moments of yellow. There's so much thought and planning that goes into these enormous artworks. But I'm going to move on because I could talk about Jackson Pollock for 100 years. Next one. There we go. So this is by Mark Rothko, and he is one of the big color field painters that confuses everybody. So this is called number 3 or number 13, and the labeling wasn't exactly clear. And Mark Rothko likes to be very literal. It is magenta, black, green on orange. Mark Rothko, 1949, oil on canvas. And look at the size. That is 2 by 1.5 meters. Imagine that in your living room. Imagine that in your bedroom. It is enormous. And how Mark Rothko painted is very different to Pollock. So what he would do is he would take his oil paint and he would thin it down using turpentine, a very toxic chemical, don't breathe it in. And he would start to layer these colors. So you can see in the bottom here that there's a little bit of yellow, which is obviously the first color that he started with. And then we've got this orange. And then we've got this purple and black layered on top of it. And then we've got white and more purple. And the orange that was painted into, the white that was painted into wet orange, which gives us this very interesting faded technique. And then we've got this green, which is very interesting when layered on top of this orange color. So what Mark Rothko was doing is he was just playing with how color looked on top of each other, because there's hundreds and hundreds of layers of color in this artwork. And it doesn't look like much, but if you ever are privileged enough to see a Mark Rothko in person, you'll be able to see how much work and effort goes into his work. I mean, if you look at these little edges here, you can see the sheer layer of magenta and then this layer of black, and then he's got another layer or two of black on top of that don't quite make it as opaque, just the opposite of see-through. Yes. And also in this corner here, we've got some really beautiful, interesting colors going on. But again, I want you to picture the size of how big this is. It's 2 by 1.5, 2 by more than 2 meters by more than 1.5 meters. So it's really, really big. And this is one of the things that is important about the abstract expressionists is the size of their work and how the size was new. It was different. Everything else before that had been quite small. But because they were dealing with such big issues, they really needed to make the paintings big to be able to accommodate these really big issues. Okay, so this is Barnett Newman. It's called One Mint One. And what Barnett Newman used to do is he would use masking tape to create these moments of zippage in his paintings. But he'd leave the masking tape on and use it to create a really interesting texture. So you can see here that the masking tape is here in the middle, and he's sort of layered the masking tape and the paint. And because he's working with oil, it doesn't really work nicely with the glue in the masking tape, so we get these really interesting textural moments here. So Barnett Newman painted a little bit smaller than the other artists, but the way that he was playing with paint and with tape created some really interesting artworks. And this is very visually simple. You guys could very easily replicate that. And I want you guys to know that proper art is not inaccessible to you. You guys can copy this and it will be proper art because you are studying Barnett Newman's paintings. So your work doesn't need to look like the Mona Lisa to be beautiful or to be art or to be valid. And I mean, I'm not a particular fan of Barnett Newman's work, but he is a valid artist. So we will study him, we will appreciate him nonetheless. Okay, so this is Clifford Still. Sorry, I couldn't get a better resolution of this painting. And it is called 1957 D number 1. It is his most famous painting. And he's got these really interesting moments of what looks like drippage, but actually isn't. And I love the way that he manages to contrast this really dark black with this bright yellow and white. If you look at it far away, it looks like some sort of animal, but it's definitely not. So again, this is a huge painting. And then in the empirical data, if you know it, please include the gallery where the work is found, because it helps us as the viewer to know, and it helps you to know how valuable the artwork is. So the first painting we looked at, the Jackson Pollock, was from the Museum of Modern Art, one of the most prestigious art galleries, museums in the world. And this gallery is prestigious, but not as much as MoMA. I mean, if you've got a painting in MoMA, you've made it. So I'm not going to analyze this too deeply, but again, it's another version of a color field painting, and it's about placement and gesture and the interaction of the human body with the artwork. So the final one we're going to look at, this is Willem de Kooning, and this is called Boudoir, French word. I think it means bedroom or chamber, something like that. But this is de Kooning making an abstract painting. I'm going to call it a painting of some sort of bedroom. So it was made in 1950, and we've got a really beautiful, interesting mix of mediums here. So we've got oil paint, enamel paint, and charcoal on paper, and the size is I want to say just smaller than A3, but don't quote me on that. So the way that he made this is with layering. And you can see here we've got the charcoal on top of the paint, and then more paint on top of the charcoal, and this very interesting mishmash of color. But what's also interesting to note is that oil and enamel are both oil-based paints, and they don't blend as nicely as you think they would because of the different natures and the way that they are made, and also what they're made for. Oil paint is typically made for art, and enamel paint is typically made for like painting metal and buildings and like painting your fence. That for me is the thing about enamel that comes to mind. So we've got these really interesting moments of pink. To me, this looks a bit like a bed sheet. This white thing looks like a pillow. We've got this bee, which could signify boudoir. It could signify anything. And then moments of abstraction happening all around the painting, and the way that the paint is and the charcoal is layered. Oh, I love this moment here specifically, one of my favorites. I love texture. So we can call this an abstract because there's nothing here that's actually identifiable except for the bee. I mean, this is a squarish shape, and that's another squarish shape, and this is a rounded squarey shape. It's basically a whole bunch of shapes and colors on the paper that are giving us this really beautiful artwork. And I think that's it for my PowerPoint. I hope that this makes sense to you guys. Please feel free to email me or message me on Teams if you have any further questions. But again, I'm going to come back to my points of art doesn't need to be realistic, recognizable, or beautiful to be counted as art, or to be counted as valid. So when you guys start your own color field paintings, I hope that you use these as inspiration for your paintings. And I also want you to think a little bit about the meaning of color, which I will go through with you guys when we do that. So yes, ending these things off is very awkward. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye.